Early morning, Sabakomo Bakomo, Namairage. Akujiringerero manamine, manawanzeru. Akujiringerero manamine, manawanzeru. Lineko, uyuringerero manamine, manawanzeru. Akira gogo anamadingo, damu ya mikira, udina madingo manamine, nawanze. Akira gogo anamadingo, damu ya mikira, udina madingo manamine, nawanze. Simuku namako, kalizina malota, bambo abada nisi ngesalandeka. Ni maloja, mambo anga tamali ngatandeka. Gondo mama, gondo une mama, gondo mama, gondo une mama, gondo mama, chala mama, utafela mwenda we. Nangomba mbio, nangomba mbio, akijesi aibae, sogo matuma. Chala manda aibae, sogo matuma unaleo. Yamba kutima kwatira mabarabara oye, zina zemusoro. Unamba kwandani kutima kwatira. Yamba kutima kwatira mabarabara oye, zina zemusoro. Unamba panga tukusomba tunza kwetu. Musoro mai. Musoro mai. Mana nenda mai waje dikukula dikukao. Okay. Mana nenda mai waje dikukula dikukao. Okay. Mapenzi ose akapenzi okay. Mapenzi ose akapenzi okay. Namba namba umatibego chembeli unali chembeli Yemeli, unali Yemeli mama mwe, Yemeli mwe, Yatare, unali Yemeli mwe, Yatare, unali Yemeli mugoma. Akidesi, inabana tabela mfuno. Agafuna bumeda. Chalamanda, inabana tabela mfuno. Agafuna bumeda. Akidesi, inabana tabela mfuno. Sinari chocho kare, kawia na polo. Wajabu na bolo wajabu wadingaingalamu tukataya kumkinga kutuma kaiduka tola obelado nanadila maiwe wajabu
A big shout out to you and a very warm welcome to the Diary of a Young Black King. It's a beautiful Saturday afternoon, the 3rd of August 2024, and the year is almost over. Started the other day, but it's almost over. 4 months to go, so we are about at 70% of the year, which just started, by the way. 12:42 East African time. Welcome to the show. Today we're gonna be talking about what we were talking about last Saturday. We were talking about Pan-Africanism. We're going to be continuing with the conversation on Pan-Africanism. We looked at quite a few Pan-Africans last week, the ones that we were able to look at. I remember we looked at Patrice Emery Lumumba, that is the first Prime Minister of the DRC. We also did look at Kwame Nkrumah. We looked at quite a few last time. So today we're going to be looking at more. We're going to be looking at the likes of Thomas Sankara. We're going to be looking at the likes of Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. And of course, we're going to be discussing everything else to do with Africa, including the new debt restructuring policy that is about to be implemented. Of course, a lot of other things. But first, I was this is a Malawian, has to be Malawian or Angolan. I'm not sure where this song comes from, but I guess it's Malawian. It's a Malawian song. I don't even know what it means, but I just love it. It's called Lini Who. It's the artist, whoever sang it, is singing to a certain guy called Lini. I don't know what Lini did or what Lini was told to do and he did not do, but a big shout out to Lini. A big shout out to the people of Malawi, if this is Malawian. And the interesting thing about this song is that the one who sang it is 93 years old. His name is the name of the artist is Gidelas Chalamanda. It's Malawian. I might be wrong, but I guess it's Malawian. But you can just feel the African touch in this song. And a big shout out to Lini and whatever he did. So we're coming back in a bit to talk about Pan-Africanism. Today we're going to be discussing more than the Pan-Africanism part. We're also going to be discussing numbers. We're going to be looking at, for example, the new report that the World Bank released the other day that is saying that a lot of African countries are stuck in what the World Bank referred to as the middle income trap. That is, they have the capability of becoming high income countries, but now they are stuck in either middle income countries or lower income countries. So they said that about 100 countries are stuck in this middle income trap unless they adopt a radical growth strategy for their economies. Not my words, the words of the World Bank cited some countries like South Africa, also cited some other countries like China, saying that even China is in the middle income trap. We're going to be looking at that report and, of course, seeing what they are suggesting as the radical growth strategy plans for the economies. We're also going to be looking at, today we're going to be discussing numbers a lot because that is an area I love. I love talking about numbers because numbers never really lie, you know. The leaders might come, the politicians might come and lie to you, but the numbers at the end of the day will not lie. When we look at the GDP, for example, it is going to reflect the real situation in the country. The politicians may lie and say the country is growing, you know, and a lot of other PR talks, but the numbers never really lie. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at Nigeria with its marches against the cost of living. I told you Tinubu bought himself a few weeks. He made a wise decision there when he bought himself a few weeks, but it has caught up with him. I don't know what he's going to do to buy himself more time. The last time he doubled the wages of everybody in Nigeria, all the civil servants. Took them off the streets for a while, but they're back. So we're going to be looking at that also. And of course, the Ethiopian issue is of real interest to me. By the Ethiopian issue, I mean the Ethiopian debt. Ethiopia has just received a huge debt from the World Bank and from the IMF. And from the report that I was saying, they're saying that Ethiopia is actually set to save 4.9 billion USD after it's completed its debt restructuring exercise. So I'm telling you, there is a new debt restructuring policy that started with Ethiopia that is now being sold to African countries with the impression that if you follow this debt restructuring policy, you might end up saving money in the debts that we gave you. So we're going to be looking at that also. And of course, everything else to do with Africa. So I'll be here for the next 2 hours talking about nothing but Africa. So I hope you're having yourself an amazing Saturday, and a big shout out to everybody who's watching me on YouTube, on Facebook, on the website, and on our radio. This is the Black Hot Fire Network, the media of the 21st century. Yes, that was Line Who by, what was the name of this musician? I've forgotten the name again. He's Malawian, so it's really hard to get Malawian names. His name is Gides Chalamanda. And apparently the song is him singing to a boy called Lemi, and he's praising him for a moment and then goes on. Anyway, that was has to be Malawian, if I'm not wrong. It's 12:50 p.m. We can now start our show officially. And we're going to start by looking at the numbers. I said we're going to be looking at a lot of the numbers today before we get to look at the part 2 of the Pan-Africans that we were looking at last week. Last week we did look at Kwame Nkrumah, who I consider the father of African democracy because he spearheaded, he saw Africa to independence. When I say he saw Africa to independence, I mean he's the one who saw Ghana to independence. Back then, it was called Gold Coast. He's the one who saw Gold Coast to independence, and Gold Coast was the first country in Africa to actually gain the independence, and that did inspire many other African countries, especially to develop military wings in their struggle, not just the intellectual wing of trying to get into the LegCo. There was the LegCo back then, the Legislative Council, of trying to send letters to London, of trying to address students in universities in the US, like the likes of Pixley Kaisaka Seme of South Africa were doing, but to develop even a military wing in their struggle. In as much as some people are fighting in the intellectual wing, trying to change the constitution to get into elective seats, he inspired Africans to also develop a military wing in the struggle, and that was seen in Zimbabwe, for example, in Tanzania with the Maji Rebellion, in Kenya with the Mau Mau. And of course, that is what accelerated the struggle for independence in Africa. That is, if you look at the other countries that gained it after Ghana did, after Gold Coast did. He was prime minister for less than a month before they tried to assassinate him. They were never successful, but at the end of the day, they were able to spark up rebellion all over Gold Coast, and he was cooled. We also looked at we looked at Kwame Nkrumah, who I said I consider the father of democracy in Africa. We also looked at Patrice Emery Lumumba. He was the first African prime minister president to be assassinated in 1961. He had not also been in power for long before they assassinated him, after a speech that he released and that he was forced to eat before he was assassinated. We looked at Kwame Nkrumah's call for the unification of Africa, not the independence of Gold Coast, but the independence of the rest of Africa. He said the independence of Gold Coast is irrelevant if the rest of Africa is not independent. Tried to rally African leaders to form a united Africa. They never listened to him. They formed the OAU, which was later compromised. Not later compromised, it was compromised from the beginning and never really served any good for the African people. And that is why 76 years later, we are talking about Nigerians continuing with the march against the cost of living. Nigerians joined the rest of Africa in the marches against, it's bigger than the cost of living, it's against poor governance, it's against corruption, it's against neocolonialism. Nigerians had threatened to go to the streets, not now, a while ago, and Bola Tinubu, in his wisdom, decided to postpone the elections in a way that he deemed. He doubled the wages of all government employees. That worked at that time, and people retreated back, and the demos were called off because, I was earning $20, now earning 40, so I'll just chill for a moment. So that did work to his advantage at first, and the protests were called off. He bought himself a few weeks. I remember saying that when I was reporting on the doubling of wages, I said Tinubu has bought himself a few weeks at least. But then the people went back, and then they realized $44 is the minimum wage in Nigeria, and realized that $44 is not what I deserve as a Nigerian citizen, with all the richness, the riches, and the fact that Nigeria is supposed to be the economic power hub of Africa, from its oil to its big population, not just a large population, but it has one of the smartest people in Africa. That is why you'll find them anywhere in the world. Go to anywhere in the world, you're going to find a Nigerian. not just going to find a Nigerian, but a Nigerian conducting business. Those people are never employed, they employ people. Doesn't matter whether the business is clean, 90% of them are never clean. Most of them are actually fraudsters, but Nigerians are one of the smartest people in Africa, and they have a large population, they are rich in minerals, they have deep cultural heritage, so it's supposed to be the economic power hub of Africa. It's supposed to be, but it's not. That is why they went back to their homes, and a few weeks later they realized, I do not deserve $44. I mean, if Tinubu could double that to 44, he can make it 200. And now they are back in the streets, because apparently Nigeria has been having a inflation happening there, and the cost of everything has gone up apart from the salaries. Everything is going up apart from the salaries, and that is how you spark up a rebellion. I don't know how the finance ministers, the presidents, and the people in charge ignore this deliberately. In as much as you're forced to do some things, you just need to use your brain a little bit for you to know that if the price of everything goes up apart from people's salaries, then they won't be enough for people to afford even the basic necessities and commodities. And that is going to anymore. So I'm gonna ask, I don't know, but that is what has been happening in Nigeria ever since Tinubu took power. Not that the Nigerian economy was better before Tinubu, it has never been better, even when Jonathan was there, even when the other one was there. I think the last sane president Nigeria had was Nnamdi Azikiwe, that is in the 60s. Ever since then, it has just been, and that is why he never really lasted in power. Ever since then, it has just been recycling of the same people with the same moral code. So now with Tinubu, when he came into power, he made things worse. Things were already worse. Things were already bad in Nigeria before he came into power. But with the economic reforms that he made, this is the reforms that I was talking about, which they have now, they have a name for them now. They are calling them the debt restructuring policies. I mean, you people have a debt, but in order for us to give you more debt, we need you to do some debt restructuring policies. Do not be lied to. Debt restructuring policies means oppressive policies for your people. And if you follow that, there is a reward. Anybody who has done the debt restructuring policies has been rewarded handsomely. Not the people, but the governments. And I think the perfect example would be Ethiopia, which did the same this week. Did the debt restructuring policies. It, for example, floated its currency, which saw it go down. It, those are the debt restructuring policies that they are talking about. One is for you to stop controlling your currency anymore. Do not, even if your currency falls to the bottom, don't touch it. You just sit back and watch your people suffer. I mean, governments have the ability to control how far their currency falls. That is in exchange maybe with the US dollar, with the euro. They have that ability to, I would say, subsidize, although the word is not subsidize, but in layman's I can say subsidize. Governments have the ability to subsidize their currency to make sure that it doesn't fall to the bottom pit. That is, for example, if the Kenyan shilling is trading at 100 bob to the US dollar in some circumstances, because they say on paper, they say that the currency is determined by demand and supply curve. So maybe due to some circumstances, the Kenyan shilling now has to go to 180. That would be very detrimental to the country's economy, because most African countries are high importing. So governments have the ability to make sure that it doesn't go to the 180. They have the ability to put in policies that ensures that it doesn't go to 180. It doesn't fall too bad. It doesn't affect the economy too bad. That is, they put in measures to control. That includes sometimes they sell bonds, sometimes they release money to balance that. But now one of the debt restructuring policies that one of the policies that are now being required of countries in order to get financing is that you do not touch your currency anymore. It doesn't matter how hard it falls, let it. And so, of course, that is having the negative effect on African economies, because African economies are high importing. They don't export anything, but they're high importing. And so for in the case of Ethiopia was given 1.5 billion USD by the World Bank and another one by the IMF. I can't remember the figure that the IMF gave it. And it was actually for the World Bank. I don't think the World Bank has approved debt this big to any African country at once. It has to be the first. I don't think it has offered such type of lending to an African country at once. I might be wrong, but I haven't seen any type of lending like the one that Ethiopia received. So apart from that, it received 4.9 billion from the IMF and 1.5 billion from the World Bank. And imagine all Ethiopia did was follow the restructuring policies that it was given. That is, float your currency, and some others that I'm gonna be talking about later, because you now required to do that. And it was actually given a 1 billion grant in addition to the loans. There's a grant of 1 billion USD. So you can see the reward that they're giving you for the same is handsome. So that means they are benefiting so much in you doing the restructuring, because in total Ethiopia received about 10.7 billion. It was a package of about 10.7 billion from the IMF, from the World Bank, and from other lenders and donors. 10.7 billion USD at once. So that is a handsome price. That is a handsome compensation for the policy. So that tells you how important those policies are to them and why they really require that once you get into power, you have to do some of those economic policies that will make sure that in as much as we give you loans, you do not benefit from the loans, because now your currency is negligible. The value of your currency is negligible in comparison to the measure, the other currencies. So you look like you received a lot of money, but you convert that to your local currency so that you can be able to use it, and then you convert it back to the USD so that you can pay the debt, and you end up losing billions and billions of money in addition to the interests that you're going to pay. So those are some of the debt restructuring policies that have been happening. We are going to come back and look at that in a minute, which is the main reason why, if you see those uprisings that you see, for example, in Nigeria, where they are now demonstrating against the high cost of living, don't look any further. It's because they're doing that. They're demonstrating because the economic policies that have been forced into Nigeria, not just since Tinubu took power, but for the longest, have all been oppressive. They are all targeted towards paralyzing the Nigerian economy. Nigeria in this case is just but a case study. It's the same in Ghana, it's the same in Ethiopia, it's the same in Kenya, it's the same in South Africa. That is why the World Bank is claiming that South Africa is in a middle income trap. So all you have to do is allow your currency to plunge down so that they can give you the loans. What they are now calling the advanced restructuring support. So that is going to see inflation in your country go up. That is going to see, even the foreign, it's not even that complicated to see. It's not even that complex to see, because once you receive such volumes of loans, and then you now have to convert it so that you can use it, and then convert it back so that you can pay, that is going to lead to high inflation. That is going to lead to foreign currency shortages, because now you'll need a lot of money to, you converted it to the Ethiopian birr, Ethiopia being an example here. You converted it to the Nigerian naira, you converted it to the Kenyan shilling, you converted it to the Ghanaian cedi, and now you've used it in whatever you are to use it for. You have stolen the amount that you have to steal, you've put the one that you have to put into development, you have done all the white elephant projects and everything, and now you have to repay back your debt. Remember, you messed up your currency to start with, you messed up your economy to start with. So inflation is already waiting for you up there with your 10.7 billion external financing. Inflation is waiting for you up there, your currency is waiting for you down there, because that's where you sent it. And now you need foreign currency in order to repay back the debt, because if I give you the debt in USD, you have to pay me back in USD. Now you can't find, there'll be foreign currency shortages, of course, because you need the USD in large volumes and you can't find it, and that leads you to defaulting because you have no other option. You have shortages in the foreign currency, you need more than you have, and your currency is degraded to a point that it's almost negligible. So you have a lot of Nigerian naira that is not helping you. You need the US dollars to repay back the debt, and that is what is leading to countries defaulting on their debts. That is what led to Ghana defaulting on its debt. That, in addition to it not having money, but even the little it had, it couldn't convert the same, because the foreign currency reserves are not enough to convert the cedi back to whatever currency you borrowed in, because if you are given the loan by the EU, they need their money back in euros. They don't need your Nigerian naira, and now you don't have enough euros to facilitate the same. You try to convert that, but nobody, your currency has no demand. Nobody wants your naira because you offer nothing in the market. You offer nothing in the international market. So nobody wants anything to do with your naira. And you need the USD to pay back debts. So you end up defaulting on your loans. Now look at you, you have defaulted on your loans. Your loans had terms, non-disclosure. They put clauses like NDC, non-disclosure clause. In addition, your debt had security. You had put in natural resources, for example, as your security. You had put a certain gold mine as your security, because most of the debts that we receive in Africa are not non-secured. We do have non-secured debts, but they are not as many as the secured ones, because they don't trust that you'll have the money to pay them back, because they know in as much as they're giving you the debt, the debts are not going to help you, so you most probably are not going to have money to repay back the debts. That is why they always require a security behind. So you find that you had put in a certain airport as your security, you had put in a certain national reserve as your security, you had put in a certain gold mine as your security, and now because they have made sure that you're going to default on your loan, you default on your loan and they take the security that you had put in as you are taking the loan. So the main objective is for them, we think that when an African country defaults on its loan, that it's a loss for the lenders, but it's never really a loss for the lenders. If you look at even the banks, when you take a loan from the bank and you do not pay it, the bank celebrates more than when you pay it, because when you do not pay it, then they can come with their auctioneers and they're going to auction more than you borrowed. So if the banks were to be asked for secured loans, they wish you are not in a position to pay, so they can come and auction more than you borrowed, because if you pay, you're going to pay just what you borrowed and maybe a little more interest. So you might think that an African country defaulting on its loan is detrimental to the lenders, but it really isn't. It's what they want sometimes, because one, they can be able to come now, they can now be able to come in now, and no international law, nobody is going to question China for going into the DRC and taking over a mine that DRC signed as a security for a loan that it hasn't been able to pay. Nobody will question when that company that was taking over JKIA will come in and take in JKIA because Kenya was not able to repay its debt. Nobody is going to question anything. So that is one. And two, they'll be able to put you in a bigger debt trap because now you are desperate. Look at what happened in Ghana. It's the same thing in Ethiopia, by the way. Ethiopia defaulted on its government debt last year because of foreign currency shortages, the war, and the fact that they did not even have enough money to run their own economy. They do not even have enough money to run their own economy, leave alone to send to the lenders. So it's also an advantage for them because now that gives them a chance to put you in a deeper debt trap. Because now apparently you'll be desperately looking for money to pay the money that you borrowed from the same lender. So you owe me money, and now you have to come back to me to ask me for money to pay me. So that now you have a bigger debt than the first one. So it's a benefit for me because I gave you money to pay me. And the money that I gave you to pay me, I gave it to you at a bigger interest rate than even the first loan. And so you'll always owe me because even this one, you'll have made sure you've messed up your economy first before I gave it to you. I've made sure that you messed up your currency, you've made sure you've messed up your economy, you've made sure that inflation is hitting you and hitting you hard before I give it to you. So that even for this one that I'm giving to you to pay me for the first one, you'll still have to come to me again for now a third loan to pay for the second one that you took to pay for the first. So the debt trap gets deeper. The debt hole gets deeper. Anyway, we're going to come back and look at that. But before that, let us look at some of the, continue with celebrating Pan-Africanism, looking at some of the biggest, most influential Pan-Africans that we had in Africa that, of course, are the reason why we have a freer Africa. It's not really as free as it should be, but it's a good step forward. So we're going to be looking at the likes of Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Cabral was a Cape Verdean and Guinean revolutionary leader who was assassinated. We're going to be looking at him. We looked at Kwame Nkrumah last week. So today we're going to be looking at Thomas Sankara to begin with, who was the first Burkinabe president. He was the president of Burkina Faso. I'm sure he would be really, really proud wherever he is, looking at how Burkina Faso has been faring on ever since ever since he was assassinated in the 80s. We're going to be looking at that and much, much more. We're going to be coming back to look at the numbers because, as I said, the numbers never lie. So we're going to be looking at Africa's debt position, looking at those restructuring policies, looking at the World Bank's report on the same, so that we can know where we are. And even as we are going to the streets to demonstrate, and we can know exactly what is it that we are fighting against, what is in their playbook, and what type of enemy are we up against. Just like we had in the first rebellion, that is the first fight for independence, where we had some people fighting in the military wing and some others fighting in the intellectual front. As we go to the streets, we still need to equip ourselves. We need to understand the numbers. We need to understand the game plan. We need to understand what is it that they really want in Africa, so that we do not just fight the smaller enemy and forget to fight the bigger enemy. We do not just fight the puppets that they have installed, but we fight the whole establishment from the top to the bottom. So let me share a copyright disclaimer on this Thomas Sankara video that I'm about to share that I came across so that YouTube does not strike it down. So this is just for educational purposes, which is allowed.
So, where the sun sears the barren earth and the wind whispers secrets of a turbulent past, a revolutionary's voice rose, echoed and reverberated across the African plains. This revolutionary was none other than Thomas Sankara, the late former president of Burkina Faso. Sankara rose to power in 1983 and he immediately became a committed, self-sacrificing rebel who, during his 4 years as a leader of a small, impoverished nation, sought to improve the lives of ordinary people while at the same time projecting the country onto the international stage. Unfortunately, on October 15, 1987, armed men burst into the office of Captain Thomas Sankara and murdered him alongside 12 of his aides in a violent coup d'etat. In events that eerily paralleled those in the Congo 27 years earlier when Patrice Lumumba was murdered, the attackers cut up Sankara's body and buried his remains in a hastily prepared grave. In this episode of African Biographics, we cover the story of an icon, Captain Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. Born on December 21, 1949, in the village of Yako in Upper Volta, now known as Burkina Faso, Thomas Isidore Noho Sankara was the third of 10 children. His father, Joseph Sankara, served in the French army during the Second World War, and his mother, Margarita Kinda, instilled in her children a strong moral compass and respect for education. His early years were spent in Gaoua, a town in the humid southwest, and as the son of one of the few African functionaries then employed by the colonial state, Thomas enjoyed a relatively privileged upbringing. The family lived in a brick house at the top of a beautiful hill overlooking the rest of the town. But young Thomas played with other children and sat alongside local classmates once he started primary school. As a result, he soon became aware of their conditions and the wider world around him. In the colonial era, Upper Volta, or Haute Volta as it was named by the French authorities, was regarded as little more than a remote backwater with few resources deemed worthy of exploitation, except as a labor reserve of young able-bodied men. This meant that Upper Volta experienced far less investment or infrastructure development than did many African colonies in the coastal regions. Compared with the practice in France's richer colonial territories, Paris sent relatively few French administrators to Upper Volta. There were enough in Gaoua, however, for the young Thomas to notice how differently they lived from the African population and how much more privileged the European children of his age were. Occasionally, Thomas Sankara got into scrapes with European children in school or around the town. When Thomas was 11 years old, just a few days before Upper Volta gained independence from France, he and some friends organized a mock ceremony to lower the French flag and raise the colors of the new nation. Now, because of this mock ceremony, a brawl ensued between European and African boys. Although Thomas himself was not involved, the school director demanded that his father punish him with a beating. His father refused. Young Thomas applied himself seriously to his schoolwork, excelling in mathematics and French. He went to church often, participated in a church scout troop, and devoted his time to religious studies. Some of the priests were impressed with his energy and eagerness to learn, and they encouraged Thomas to go to a seminary school once he had finished his primary courses. Thomas initially agreed, but he also took the exam required for entry into the 6th grade in the secular educational system. He passed this exam. When his father, Joseph Sankara, told the priest that Thomas would not be joining a seminary after all, they responded that he had not prayed hard enough for his son. Thomas Sankara continued his education at a state secondary school. Here, he continued to concentrate on his regular studies. He still did very well in mathematics and French, took part in theater productions, went to the movies, and started a regimen of physical exercise. As a student, Thomas Sankara became known for his exceptional intelligence and strong moral compass. He quickly became a respected figure among his peers and teachers alike. Meanwhile, the newly independent country was in turmoil. Upper Volta's first president, Maurice Yameogo, was never a particularly inspiring figure. He maintained a strong connection to France, with numerous French advisors working in both the army and the civil administration. Over time, President Yameogo became more autocratic and jailed many of his critics. The president even appointed relatives to key positions and engaged in extravagant personal spending while simultaneously imposing austerity on state employees and cracking down on trade unions. At the same time, President Yameogo appeared oblivious as his unpopularity grew. This situation finally came to a head on January 3, 1966, when workers launched a general strike. Large crowds of students, unemployed youths, workers, and others poured into the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, in a popular insurrection. After army officers refused to follow the president's orders to disperse the demonstrators by force, it was clear for all to see that President Yamaogo was finished. He agreed to resign and hand power over to the army commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sangwele Lamizana. While all of this was taking place, Sankara was focused on his final secondary school exams. He did hear over the radio, however, that Lamizana had established a new military academy in Ouagadougou, the first in the country, and that, as part of its first cohort of prospective junior officers, it would take in 3 students who had just obtained their secondary school certificates. The military was popular at the time, having just ousted President Yamaogo, the hated president. Young Thomas Sankara joined the academy's first intake in 1966 at the tender age of 17, stepping onto the same career path his father had once pursued. As with his earlier studies, Sankara took the challenges of the military academy seriously. Although the physical training was rigorous, especially for someone of modest build, he persisted and actually began to thrive. The military academy also taught its trainee officers a variety of academic subjects, including social sciences. For those topics, it employed civilian professors, and one of them was the academic director, Adama Toure, who taught history and geography at the academy. In his lectures, Adama Toure talked about imperialism and neocolonialism, socialism and communism, the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, the liberation movements in Africa, and other similar topics. Although Sankara had already started to become politically aware, this was the first time he was exposed to a revolutionary perspective on the Upper Volta and the world at large. 3 years later, Thomas Sankara completed his studies at the military academy. He was one of just 2 graduates selected for more advanced officer training in Madagascar. Thomas arrived there in October of 1969. At the academy in Madagascar, the range of instruction went beyond standard military subjects. Sankara was particularly drawn to courses on agriculture, including how to raise crop yields and better the lives of farmers, themes he would later take up in his own country. Beyond widening his knowledge and range of skills, he lost no opportunity to supplement his official instruction with further political education. Several of his professors at the academy in Madagascar were left-wing French academics, and Sankara sometimes had dinner with them. His last year in Madagascar coincided with an unprecedented period of political turmoil marked by peasant revolts, general strikes, huge public demonstrations against a conservative pro-French regime, and finally, a military takeover that steadily brought ever more radical officers into high positions of power. In the early 1970s, Thomas Sankara was sent to the prestigious Parachute Training Center in France. He worked his way up the ranks in the military while also making contacts with African radical students and organizations in France that helped shape his revolutionary mentality. In 1974, he returned to Upper Volta and began actively participating in meetings of various left-wing groups, among them some of the more prominent trade unions. Sankara would attend these meetings usually dressed in civilian clothes. All of these meetings were held secretly since the law prohibited any gatherings of groups opposing the government. Sankara's involvement with these groups proved critical to forging relationships that helped him assume power in the 1980s. Thomas Sankara served on the front lines in a border war between Upper Volta and Mali in 1974, although he saw this dispute over a worthless strip of land as a futile exercise. He thought the war was senseless, having erupted over some badly drawn lines on a colonial map and pitting 2 poor African countries with shared cultural and ethnic affinities. The experience of the war also appears to have further alienated Sankara from the military's higher command. At the time, he had become disillusioned with the senior officers, and this war simply confirmed in his eyes that the officers were more attentive to lining their own pockets than to the conditions of their troops or the need for an efficient, professional army capable of defending the country. Anyways, Thomas Sankara became commander of his country's Commando Training Center in 1976, and 2 years later established an important friendship with the man who was to become his best friend, Captain Blaise Compaoré, after meeting him in Morocco. Though focused on his responsibilities at the training center and on his new family life, Sankara remained painfully aware of the desperate conditions facing his country's people. The Upper Volta was one of the poorest nations in the world. Its 7 million inhabitants at the time had an annual average per capita income of just $211. Less than 1 in 10 lived in a city, and the adult literacy rate barely reached 11%. Only 18% of children of school-going age were in primary school, and a mere 3% made it to secondary school. Recurrent droughts, soil erosion, and stagnant crop yields meant that hunger was common. Poor nutrition and disease cut lives very short. The average life expectancy was an abysmal 44 years. Fueled by anger at such a reality, Sankara's conviction deepened that fundamental change had to come. During his visits to the capital, Ouagadougou, and on yet more military training missions to France and Morocco, he systematically pursued contacts with those who thought likewise. Some of those like-minded individuals were in the military, including Captain Blaise Compaoré. For Sankara and his colleagues, change in Upper Volta was very much needed. Yet Sankara's study of revolutions had taught him that it could be reckless to act prematurely. So he and his colleagues bided their time, at least for a little while longer. On November 25, 1980, Colonel Saye Zebo led a coup d'etat in Upper Volta under the pretext of eroding state authority. In late 1981, as Saye Zebo's fragile military regime sought to shore up its credibility, it brought in Thomas Sankara as Minister of Information. Unfortunately, that move backfired. Thomas Sankara supported the local media in exposing high-level corruption, and when the regime turned more repressive, he resigned and publicly denounced it. Detention and house arrest followed. Another military coup, this time partly reflecting the growing strength of younger left-leaning officers, took place on November 7, 1982. It was led by Captain Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, who then appointed.
So we're just looking at the story of Thomas Sankara and how he rose into power and was later killed in the 80s. And of course, that was in Burkina Faso, a country that has also, you can actually see in those countries that had, especially countries that had armed rebellion, they fought against they had a military wing in their fight. You can see those are some of the countries that the uprisings have started happening again. An example being Burkina Faso, an example being Nigeria, an example being Kenya, an example being Uganda. But if you look at countries that never had an armed rebellion, that is, look at countries like South Africa that never really fought for anything militarily. Look at them and look at how they are. So it is true that when certain precedents are set, then the people will always, for example, with Thomas Sankara, it's almost the same thing that is happening at the moment in Burkina Faso. You know, it's almost the same thing when you look at the likes of Traore. You look at Traore, you see Sankara. So we're just looking at what led to his assassination.
Thomas Sankara as Prime Minister of Upper Volta on January 10, 1983. As Prime Minister, Sankara began his foreign state trips to Tripoli, Libya, and attended the Non-Aligned Summit in New Delhi, India, where he met Fidel Castro, Samora Machel of Mozambique, and Maurice Bishop of Grenada. As Prime Minister, Thomas Sankara started preaching an anti-imperialistic message. His anti-imperialist stance and his rapidly growing grassroots popularity increasingly put him at odds with conservative elements in Upper Volta, including President Ouedraogo. Again, Thomas Sankara used state office to agitate for change, including by supporting labor mobilizations, denouncing corruption, criticizing the conservative sway of traditional chiefs, and espousing anti-imperialist foreign policy positions. Unsurprisingly, alarm bells sounded in France, which was now starting to become worried about the political evolution of one of its old colonies, Upper Volta. The conservative senior officers in President Ouedraogo's regime were encouraged to mount an internal coup in May of 1983 to depose and arrest Thomas Sankara and his closest colleagues. However, this did not go as planned. Large demonstrations hit Ouagadougou involving high school students, youths from poor neighborhoods, and some trade unionists. The protesters chanted "Free Sankara" and chanted slogans against France. Secret civilian committees were formed to oppose this coup d'etat, and anti-government factions were formed in the military. The most serious of these was a paratrooper garrison in Po that remained under the control of Captain Blaise Compaoré, then a Sankara loyalist. Finally, on August 4, 1983, Blaise Compaoré led some 250 paratroopers to Ouagadougou to seize major installations in coordination with Sankara, other military personnel, and units of civilian supporters. By that evening, Sankara was on the air to proclaim the overthrow of the government and the creation of a new National Council of the Revolution, the CNR. At just 34 years old, Captain Thomas Sankara had become the youngest leader of an African republic. Top of President Sankara's political agenda was waging war on poverty, which reached a critical level due to a horrible drought that ravaged the country in 1983 and 1984. To this end, he nationalized all land and mineral wealth and implemented state-led agricultural programs. His audacious agrarian reform took away land from feudal landlords and put it into the hands of peasants. This reform saw agricultural production skyrocket, safeguarding the nation's food security. Thomas Sankara's reforms were widespread, both at a symbolic level and in terms of political and economic reforms. For instance, in 1984, he changed the country's name from Upper Volta, the name it kept from colonialism, to Burkina Faso, which translates to the land of the upright people. Indeed, he strived to free his nation from the chains of colonial dependency and instill a sense of pride and cultural heritage. His regime outlawed tribute payments and obligatory labor to village chiefs, abolished rural poor taxes, built railways, and kick-started public housing construction. Thomas Sankara's administration also aggressively embarked on an anti-corruption drive in the civil service. The government also launched initiatives towards environmental sustainability. Understanding the relationship between deforestation and agricultural productivity, they kicked off a nationwide 10 million tree planting initiative to combat desertification that was creeping in from the Sahara. This would be one of the first major afforestation projects in Africa. Women, the poor, and the country's peasantry benefited mostly from these reforms. Thomas Sankara's government promoted gender equality in a very male-dominated society. In fact, Thomas Sankara was one of the first heads of state to condemn female genital mutilation, forced marriages, underage marriages, and polygamous practices. Sankara once told a local audience in 1984, "Socially, women are relegated to third place after the man and the child, just like the third world, arbitrarily held back." President Thomas Sankara appointed females into high government positions, encouraged them to work and become financially independent, and recruited them into the military. In September 1984, one day marked the day where men were encouraged to switch roles with women by, for instance, going to the market for food shopping and preparing meals at home. All of these roles were traditionally done by women in Burkina Faso. This practical exercise was enforced and encouraged by Sankara so that men could get first-hand experience and know what women go through in taking care of their families. In healthcare, Sankara launched a vaccination campaign on an unprecedented scale. This vaccination drive led to about 2.5 million children being immunized against diseases such as meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. This significantly lowered child mortality rates. President Sankara also established health centers throughout the country. This included establishing more than 284 clinics for childbirth as well as 87 pharmacies. Education also saw a significant uplift under Sankara's leadership. A nationwide literacy campaign saw school attendance rise dramatically, taking literacy rates from a dismal 13% in 1983 to an impressive 73% by the year 1987. President Thomas Sankara became popular for how he openly disdained the customary pomp and ceremony that generally come with high office. For example, official portraits of the president, so common in public buildings across Africa, were prohibited. Young activists were discouraged from chanting his name. Thomas Sankara was normally driven to meetings and public events not in limousines but in modest cars. Once a week, he played soccer with his advisors and staff, and passers-by could see him dressed in shorts and a football jersey. Sometimes Sankara appeared unannounced at public events, with participants only gradually becoming aware of his presence when they glanced to the side or rear and saw him quietly standing there, perhaps wearing a tracksuit. Such levels of informality from the president were designed to send a message, with the message being that leaders should be modest and that, especially in such a poor country, they should not live the high life. The president discouraged the luxuries that came with government offices and encouraged others to do the same. In this regard, Thomas Sankara earned a modest salary of around $450 a month and forbade the use of a chauffeur-driven Mercedes and first-class airline tickets by his ministers and senior civil servants. In a country where civil service salaries were far above the incomes of most other Burkinabe, with the public sector taking up a big share of the state budget, Sankara tightened up considerably on the incomes and perks that state employees had come to expect. Numerous bonuses were simply eliminated. These measures caused considerable disgruntlement throughout the civil service, even though the upper echelons generally had to give up a bigger share. Government ministers and other senior officials lost their expense accounts. Two-thirds of the government's auto fleet was sold off, and only small cars were kept, even for ministers. State officials who were assigned individual cars were strictly prohibited from keeping them outside working hours without permission. This was done to prevent them from using the vehicles for informal business activities. True to his frugal ways, Sankara ensured that the costs of official travel were kept to a minimum. Burkinabe officials traveling abroad were required to fly economy class and stay in the most modest accommodations, including official consular or embassy residences. A staff member of Burkina Faso's United Nations mission in New York recalled Sankara's 1984 visit there. On this particular occasion, mattresses were put on the mission floors for government ministers accompanying him. President Sankara reminded them that the money saved on hotel bills would be better used for new wells and schools back home in Burkina Faso. In 1987, his last year in power, Thomas Sankara publicly declared all the sources of income and assets of himself and his wife Mariam. From the items declared, it was clear that President Sankara had not used his position as leader to amass wealth. His two sons remained enrolled in public school, while his wife continued to report daily.
That is the difference between the real Pan-Africans and the other installed Pan-Africans, because we really did have a lot of installed Pan-Africans. That is, people who we were forced to believe were Pan-Africans, but they really were never Pan-Africans. That is, and this goes especially for most of the first prime ministers, first presidents were installed. And some of them ended up being real Pan-Africans out of choice, but majority of the first prime ministers in those African countries, majority of them had actually been installed there for continuity purposes. That is, the ones who installed them expected them to continue running the affairs of the white man. So that was the expectation, really. So the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, those are the ones who were installed but ended up siding with the people because they knew what was happening. They knew the plan, and they knew that they at the end of the day, whatever actions they were going to have was going to affect the people. So you look at the difference between them and the others, because you had the others who were never removed, they were never assassinated, they were never cooled because they followed what they were told. You look at them, one of their major characteristics was amassing wealth. Amassing wealth in terms of stealing from the people. But for the likes of Thomas Sankara, they never stole from the people. That is why they were assassinated. That's why they were removed. You look at Patrice Lumumba, had the same characteristics. Never stole from the people, speaking for the people, assassinated or removed, replaced by somebody who could easily be manipulated, replaced by Mobutu Sese Seko, who ended up being one of the richest people in Africa.
for her job at the government's shipping agency, where she was a transportation specialist. His parents lived in the same house they'd occupied before. His father had now retired, but his mother was still selling spices and condiments to bring in some extra income. Around the world, Thomas Sankara soon became famous for his rebuke of what he saw as the neo-colonial relations between Europe and Africa, characterized by financial exploitation in the form of loans and aid from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. To him, this relationship was a new form of the same old dynamic between former colonial powers and formerly colonized countries. He even stated that imperialism is a system of exploitation that occurs not only in the brutal form of those who come with guns to conquer territory. Imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: a loan, food aid, and blackmail. We are fighting this system that allows a handful of men on earth to rule all of humanity. Rejecting aid from the IMF and the World Bank, Sankara strived for local economic development, hoping to place Burkina Faso on a path to financial independence.
De quoi nous nourrir? Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspire, qui installe dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiant.
It was at the
And that was what Sankara was talking about, is what is actually happening right now, where most African countries have been reduced to beggars. That takes me back to the conversation that we were having earlier on Ethiopia, the conversation that we were having earlier on Nigeria, the conversation that we were having earlier on Ghana, the conversation that we had earlier on Kenya. That is where African countries have been reduced to now, reduced to beggars. Even though they have the capacity to feed the world, they have to depend on the other part of the world to feed them. I don't think there is any other image that can portray neocolonialism as clearly as the fact that Africa, which has the best soils, has the best climate, has the best seeds, has the best... Africa, which is supposed to be feeding the world, ends up getting fed by the world. Every year we still have to have poverty porn being done in Sudan, of people dying of hunger and malnutrition in DRC. That is as a result of the imperialism, not just the economic, because it goes beyond the economic imperialism. Because for the economic imperialism, I mean, I always give an example of Uganda. If you go to Uganda, Uganda is a poor country, a very poor country with a GDP of, I don't even know, they have a very small GDP. It's a poor country. But I don't know if they've ever died of hunger. I'm not sure, because I've been to Uganda for a while. And those people have food. They have plenty and plenty of food, healthy food. I don't think there is too much GMO in Uganda as there is in these other African countries like Kenya. So you find, like, for countries like Uganda, people do not really have money, but they have food. So they are always full. Poor, broke, but well fed. So it goes beyond even economic imperialism. It goes to full imperialism, where they now determine the type of crops we produce, when we are going to harvest them, the type of seeds we're going to use. That is why you look at the countries, especially the countries that are going through the economic turmoil that we've been seeing. You look at them, and you look at them on paper, you're going to see they're the biggest exporters of some nonsense. Ghana, the biggest exporter of cocoa. Ethiopia, which I was talking about, the biggest exporter of coffee. Kenya, the biggest exporter of tea. So you look at those countries, especially in terms of agriculture, you're going to see they're always the biggest exporter of something irrelevant, biggest exporter of horticultural products, biggest exporter of berries, And so that would be a good thing. I always say that would be a good thing if you're actually making good money from it. If Ethiopia was actually, you being the biggest exporter of coffee in the world, and for the fact that coffee is one of the most popular drinks anywhere. You go to anywhere in the world and you're going to find coffee literally anywhere in the world. So for the fact that you're the biggest producer, then you should be rich. But now, because of the economic imperialism that has seen your currency devalued 5 times over, then even the coffee that you're producing is never really going to help you, because it's paid in dollars and then you have to convert it back to your currency, which has been devalued in order for you to use it, and the farmer ends up getting peanuts for his coffee. And now the problem comes in that the farmer got peanuts for the coffee, and the farmer allocated his whole land towards planting coffee. So now the farmer does not have food to eat, and he does not have money to use, because the money was peanuts. The money was peanuts. That's why I like Uganda. I love Uganda. They do not have money, but they have food. They produce their own food. So it would be one thing to be broke, but now you broke because the money that you are paid was in your devalued currency, brought down the value so that it doesn't help you at all. So it goes even to them determining that, and having regulations that were made in the 60s and the 50s still regulating our agriculture. For example, I understand in Kenya it's illegal to uproot coffee, what are they called, the coffee trees. You can't uproot that unless you get a permit, which you're not going to get. You can't uproot the tea also. So now it's my farm, it's my shamba, it's my land, but you determine what I have to plant and how much I'm going to sell it. So we end up producing and exporting a lot of nonsense, which wouldn't be nonsense if we had functional financial bodies and policies that would allow for us to get good money from, because I know there are people who make good money from the coffee that Ethiopians export. Look at Nescafe. Look at how much they sell a sachet of coffee. So Ethiopia would actually benefit from its coffee if it had the right framework, would it not? Kenya would benefit from its tea if it actually had a proper framework. So would Ghana from its cocoa. So would Nigeria from whatever nonsense it exports. I don't know what it exports, but I'm sure there is some crop that is, they make sure that you produce food you can't eat and that you can't benefit from. So you end up broke and with no food to eat. And that is why the question is, how comes Africa, the richest country, the richest continent in the world, rich in terms of the fertility of the soil, rich in terms of the favorable climate? How comes it still borrows for food? How come Kenya received grain donation from Ukraine, a country that is at war, is donating food to us, and we do not have a war going on, but from maybe the war against neocolonialism? And so we start borrowing from the food to the money to even borrowing how they dress and their culture and everything else and their religion. We borrow and borrow everything from the bottom upwards. And that is why it is very important, those economic policies that they implicate on us, it's very important for them. They make sure that those policies are followed. That is why you look at Ethiopia and you see how handsomely it was rewarded for devaluing its currency, and you wonder why would they do that? Because they know even the money that they are going to give to Ethiopia, it's 60-70% of it will be stolen. They don't really care about that. They don't care where the money goes as long as we gave you the money. The rest is going to be devalued. They're going to lose a lot of money in the devaluation, in the exchange. Now Ethiopia will have to continue exporting coffee berries at throwaway prices, because they can't even have the brains to think about how about we add value to our coffee and we have an Ethiopian coffee production plant. Imagine that. Imagine having an Ethiopian coffee production plant. Processing, sorry. Not even Nescafe would see it in terms of quality, because Ethiopia has the best quality coffee in the world. So does Kenya with tea. But the economic imperialism, the imperialism in terms of everything is too deep for us to even produce our own food. For us to even produce enough to eat. So that was the story of Thomas Sankara, a man who wondered and wondered many times why Africa cannot even be able to produce enough to eat. You can see his spirit in Traore, who was also asking the same question. The question that our generation is asking is, why are we poor in the richest continent in the world? What is not happening? And for the fact that they have started to see the answers, and for the fact that the people have started understanding that sometimes even the enemies, the people who've been fighting for are too small of an enemy, and the enemy is bigger than them. But the problem is not this puppet, because if it were not for this puppet, then there would be another one. He's just irrelevant, If he was not there, then another one would be there doing the same thing he's doing. And if that other one was not there, then another one would be there. And now, the fact that people are starting to see that this is too small of a fish for us to concentrate on, let's go for the one who installed this one, so that even when we deal with this one, they won't be in a position to install another one. Let's do away with the whole system. That was Thomas Sankara and how he was killed. I know it's a long video. We can watch it for a few more minutes, then we can look at some other Pan-African who I really love. We're gonna look at Muammar Gaddafi. What happened to Muammar Gaddafi? Why was he assassinated? I wanted to say he has to be the latest African president assassination, but then I remembered there are others even after him. So we're going to be looking at him, and of course we're going to be looking at the man who wanted to transform Nigeria into the biggest economy in the world, because Nigeria has the capacity to become the biggest economy in the world. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria.
Organization of African Unity, the OAU, that his speeches were the most fervent. Thomas Sankara called for unity and denounced neo-colonialism and the unjust debt imposed on African nations.
Qui ici ne souhaite pas que la dette soit purement simplement effacée? Celui qui ne le souhaite pas, il peut sortir, prendre son avion et aller tout de suite à la Banque mondiale payer. Tous nous souhaitons. Notre conférence adopte la nécessité de dire clairement que nous ne pouvons pas payer la dette. Non pas.
Sankara was sending a clear message to African countries that they had to be self-reliant and not depend on foreign aid, which often came with conditions that undermined their sovereignty. He argued that, unlike Europe, which was assisted to rebuild post-war, Africa was instead being asked to pay those who brought war and plunder to it. Such hypocrisy and double standards were deemed unacceptable by Thomas Sankara, which is why he strongly urged Africa to act as a united bloc in refusing to pay. Despite the profound and sweeping changes that marked Thomas Sankara's tenure, his revolutionary approach also made him enemies both at home and abroad, ultimately leading to his assassination in a coup d'etat in 1987. But more on this later. President Thomas Sankara's regime was not immune to undemocratic practices. Beneath the show of empowerment and progress, there were undercurrents of controversy that would leave somewhat of a blemish on his legacy. Even the most brilliant of leaders, such as Thomas Sankara, can't escape the touch of authoritarianism. For instance, his revolutionary defense committees, initially designed to be community empowerment platforms, often took on a more sinister role, clamping down on dissent and enabling arbitrary arrests. Many people were the victims of summary judgments by People's Revolutionary Tribunals, which sentenced lazy workers, counter-revolutionaries, and corrupt officials. Thomas Sankara himself was also accused of corruption. On the economic front, President Sankara's decision to dissolve the feudal farming system aimed to sever the chains of exploitation. Yet this precipitated clashes with traditional leaders and steered social unrest. Additionally, relations with labor unions began to sour. The president banned trade unions and political parties and put down protests, notably one by teachers in 1986. His dissolution of unions, replacing them with committees for the defense of the revolution, struck a sour note, fanning the flames of discontent among some of the people in Burkina Faso. Thomas Sankara's outspoken anti-imperialist stance and his vocal criticism of foreign aid strained his relationships with Western nations, most notably France, Burkina Faso's former colonial master. By 1987, Sankara was politically isolated. His enemies, who were a mix of the French political establishment and regional leaders like Ivorian President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, began to tire of him. He had humiliated French President François Mitterrand in public on a few occasions.
Je suis comme lui. Il dit ce qu'il pense, je le dis aussi. Et je trouve que dans un certain nombre de ses jugements, il a le tranchant d'une belle jeunesse et le mérite d'un chef d'État totalement dévoué à son peuple. Et moi, j'admire ses qualités qui sont grandes, mais il tranche trop aussi. Il va plus loin qu'il ne faut, à mon avis, qui me permettent de lui parler du haut de mon expérience.
At the same time, some of his citizens became wary of their leaders' policies. What Sankara continued to ignore was a growing skepticism about the efficacy of his policies and actions. In May of 1984, an alleged coup d'etat against Thomas Sankara erupted, and the alleged plotters were tried and executed in June of the same year. Perhaps most devastatingly, Thomas Sankara's radical reforms steered opposition within his own ranks, leading to his tragic downfall.
So that was the sponsored chaos that I always talk about, that they instill in countries they can't control. It's the same thing that is happening in Niger at the moment, where there are uprisings all over. I don't know, jihadist groups coming up that were never there, murdering people here and there, because they know as a united front, as a united country, it's so hard because they do not have the numbers and the boots to get to the ground in order for them to, let's say, overthrow a certain leader in a certain country. When the country is united, that's why it's really hard for them to touch people like Traore at the moment. They might want to, but Burkina Faso is too united for them. They step on the ground and the people will be against them. They try to coup him, and whoever tried to coup him will have to face the people. So that's why it's unlikely that they attack a unified front. It's very unlikely that they do that. And the strategy is to make sure that you're disunited so that it's easy to now strike in the middle of your disunity. That's what they've been trying to bring in Niger, with jihadist groups all over, attacking here, attacking there, and now you don't know who is attacking who, and the people no longer feel protected by the government. And now, even if a coup is organized, then you already disunited. They don't even need to disunite you anymore. That is what happened with Sankara. That is why they even had the first coup. The first failed coup was in 1984. It was never successful, but they wanted to coup him as early as 1984. That was when he was too loud for them. He never gave a hoot about anybody, not even the French president. And he would not speak behind his back, no, he would speak in front of him. And so that is why that is when they started planting uprisings. They started paying off people in his government, and the disunity began in Burkina Faso. And that took Burkina Faso so many steps behind, because you look at Burkina Faso after Thomas Sankara was killed, you look at the people who took over Compaore, you look at the people who, they were selfish people, and that is why Burkina Faso is poor. It's a poor country in reality. You look at it right now. What's the GDP of Burkina Faso? It's a poor country, but that was on the right trajectory. But because of, once they did away with the man who would have seen them to that, their GDP is 18 billion. 18 billion is, I don't even know. I can't even say it's low. It's pathetic. That is some of the lowest GDPs in the world. It's pathetic. But the trajectory that Upper Volta had, because back then it was called Upper Volta, and Sankara, and with his economic reforms, of course, they say he was a dictator. Some might argue that sometimes he was a dictator. I don't know how true that is, but what I know is, as a leader, when uprising starts getting sponsored against you, when people starts rising against you, when you know people are being paid to coup you, are you going to sit down and be democratic and still talk about? Of course you're going to fight back, because you know who is fighting you. Sometimes when you wrestle with a pig, you have to get dirty too. It's hard for you to wrestle with a pig without you wanting to get dirty. It's gonna win. That is the approach that the Sahel should be using also, because the uprisings have just started and they're going to get more and more. You saw 100 people were killed in a wedding in Mali. Niger has been having those attacks by the jihadist ISIS affiliated groups. There was an attack in Burkina Faso too. And the mistake that they're making is depending on the Wagner. The Wagners are paid mercenaries. They go for the highest bidder, one, and two, they have their own selfish interest, which you can't blame them for. Everybody has their own selfish interest at the end of the day. So the mistake that they are making is depending on the Wagners, which they shouldn't be depending on them. They should be forming, and forming is not even the term, they should be operationalizing the Sahel army. Should be looking for a way to operationalize the Sahel army, so that when there is a jihadist attack in Mali, then it's not Mali dealing with the jihadist attack, it is the Sahel army dealing with whoever touched Mali. If there is an attack in Niger, then it's the Sahel army dealing with whoever touched Niger. And a big shout out to Robert Williams and Byron Scott who are with me. Blessings to you. So it's a mistake when they depend on those foreign, you do away with the French forces and you now welcome the Wagners. Maybe for them to train you, that's a good approach. Maybe if you inviting them for them to maybe train you, and because they might be having more advanced in terms of skills and in terms of equipment. So if you're buying equipment from them and having them train your forces, that's a good strategy. But depending on them entirely for your, then that, they're builders, you paid for them to be there. That means another person pays more than you paid, then they are going to go on that side. And the people you're fighting for have unlimited supply of money. So buying off the Wagners would be in a moment. And you wouldn't know, you would be the same people guarding your palace will be the one shooting you on the head. So that is what happened to Sankara. They started sponsoring uprisings against him. And even the people he knew and trusted in his government, most of them were paid off. And the narrative of Sankara is a dictator started kicking in. Reminds me of that man who said, if the West ever praises me, then know that I've failed you as a people. And by the fact that the West was so mad at Sankara shows you that Burkina Faso would not be having a GDP of 18 billion if he was still the leader today. It would not be one of the poorest countries in the world. If you look at their GDP, if it were not for. That is why even today the people of Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, look at how rich their country is, and then look at their standards of their lives, and they do not see a connection. But I would say they are on the right track right now. They have somebody who I would compare to Sankara.
His friend and confidant, Captain Blaise Compaoré, turned against him, orchestrating the coup that would ultimately cost Thomas Sankara's life. The relationship between Blaise Compaoré and Thomas Sankara, previously very close friends and brothers in arms, had turned bitter after the duo had a different view after the August Revolution of 1983. Some sources said that disagreements emerged over the implementation and pace of reforms following the revolution. Thomas Sankara, in his favor for radical transformation, was determined to completely uproot the status quo. On the flip side, Blaise Compaoré, though also a revolutionary, was a bit more conservative in his approach. He reportedly squirmed at the breakneck speed of Sankara's reforms, uncomfortable with the magnitude of the changes. But ambition, they say, is a green-eyed monster. Some suggest that Blaise Compaoré, a powerful figure within Sankara's government and his second-in-command, may have been driven by the lure of power.
I think Compaoré was not even driven by the lure of power or anything. He was just paid off, and you know what happens with Africans, those African puppets. Whenever they see money, they lose everything else. They lose their thinking capacity, and all they now see is the money. So he was among the people who are. Look at what happened when he took power in 1987. He served for so many years. He served up to until 2014. How many years were those? From 1987 to 2014, Blaise Compaoré was the second president of Burkina Faso, having taken power from the 1987 coup d'etat. It was during that period that corruption was at its highest in Burkina Faso. It was that at that point. It was at that period that between 1987 to 2014, when Burkina Faso had a GDP. That is when they cemented their GDP of 18 billion. So that is the type of leader they had. So that tells you that it was all about greed and, of course, being paid off, because he's the one who led the coup. He was the one who led the coup in Burkina Faso in 19. He's the one who, when Burkina Faso looks at its problems and how it ended up having a GDP of 18 billion, despite it being one of the richest countries in the world, then the name Blaise Compaoré should be at the top. Although, as I said, sometimes the fish is too small for us to even look at him, because if he had not done it, then they would have paid somebody else to do it. Only that he was a very, very close associate of Sankara, very close in the 80s. I'm not sure he was the one responsible for the 1984 attempted coup, but the 1987 one that saw his close associate die from it, was the one responsible. So even as some of these things we look at should serve as lessons even to the other African countries that are fighting for their liberation, the second liberation, I like to call it, the likes of Burkina Faso, the likes of Mali, the likes of Niger, the likes of they should be, even as for somebody like Captain Ibrahim Traore, he should be looking at the people close to him. Because once they have sparked disunity in Burkina Faso again, because they don't like the direction that Burkina Faso is heading, for them they want somebody like Compaoré who they can always give instructions to. They want people like Christian Kabore, who took over after Compaoré in 2015. He was in power for about 7 years until he was removed in 2022. So they want people like those ones. So he should be, even the ones who are there right now, they should be really careful about the people close to them, because those ones are the ones, if they have loose moral standards, which most of them do, if they have a prize, then they will be bought and they'll be the ones backing the attempted coups. So they have to be really careful about that and not blindly trust everybody closer to them. So I don't know if time is going to allow us to look at one other Pan-African, because we're almost done with Sankara, who was very, very monumental in Burkina Faso. You would have seen that West African country, the Upper Volta, you would have seen it become a very successful country, prosperous country, but at that time he couldn't be allowed. It was in the 80s. People did not even understand what neocolonialism was, and so even when he was coup, the people did not even know who could him. They thought that it was Compaore, but they didn't know there were bigger forces than Compaore, and Compaore was just but a puppet on strings, and the one pulling the strings was somebody with more sinister ulterior motives. He wanted to make sure that Burkina Faso remains poor as other African countries are.
On the morning of October 15, 1987, a day that will be etched in the annals of Burkina Faso's history, President Thomas Sankara held a meeting with Blaise Compaore. Their agenda was to discuss the formation of a unified political party to preserve the revolution. Shortly after the meeting, the once peaceful presidential compound was shattered by the ominous sounds of gunfire. 12 people were killed that day, and among them was a beacon of the Burkinabe revolution, Thomas Sankara. Sankara's body was dismembered and he was quickly buried in an unmarked grave, while his widow, Mariam, and 2 children fled out of the country. In the aftermath, the Revolutionary Council, now under Blaise Compaore's rule, declared that Thomas Sankara had died of natural causes. The truth, however, could not be buried. Despite their attempts to distort the narrative, the reality of Sankara's brutal assassination sent shockwaves throughout Burkina Faso and the world. Though Blaise Compaore pretended to publicly grieve to preserve his legacy, he quickly set about purging the government of Sankara's supporters. In contrast to the cool reception given to Sankara earlier, Compaore was welcomed by Western governments and funding agencies. Within 3 years, Compaore had accepted a massive IMF loan and instituted a structural adjustment program for Burkina Faso. The new leader also reversed most of Sankara's reforms. This included the insistence that his portrait be hung in all public places, as well as buying himself a presidential jet. One day I'll do a full video on Blaise Compaore.
So that was Thomas Sankara and how he was assassinated, removed from power. I wanted us to also look at the first Nigerian president who I consider. And a big shout out to General Mosquito, who's with me. Hope you're having an amazing Saturday, General. So we're going to look at the last Pan-African we're going to look at is Nnamdi Azikiwe. He was the first president of Nigeria. And I'm going to be telling you why I think he was also a very monumental Pan-African, and why, had he been the Nigerian president for a little bit longer, then perhaps Nigeria would not be as messed up as it is right now.
Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria. Nnamdi Azikiwe was a Nigerian nationalist, journalist, and politician who fought bravely for Nigeria's independence. After Nigeria became a federal republic in 1963, Azikiwe wrote his name in the history books by becoming the first democratically elected president of Nigeria. His presidency, which was characterized by tremendous gains in the health and education.
And the problem with one, I believe that every first African president, prime minister, looks like I've lost the video. Let me reshare the video. I say one thing I know, I believe in, is that the first African presidents and prime ministers were strategically placed there for the benefit of the white man. However, some of them, like Azikiwe, never ended up following the script, and they ended up doing, because it was at that time the advancements that were made in Nigeria, especially in terms of healthcare and in terms of development, they have not even been seen, they have not been replicated many years later.
education sectors, sadly came to an end following the 1966 military coup. For his undying support of Nigerian nationalism, black pride, and empowerment, he is generally considered one of the key founding fathers of modern Nigeria. This video presents the major facts and accomplishments of Nnamdi Azikiwe, the man who tried to restore the dignity and pride of the black man. Major accomplishments by Nnamdi Azikiwe. He fought hard to end segregation during British colonial rule. In addition to his numerous achievements, Azikiwe was involved in efforts to desegregate the Nigerian football leagues. He viewed segregation based on race, ethnic identities, and religion as an affront to the blacks. And even after Nigeria gained independence in 1960, he stayed at the forefront, fighting against people who wanted to use sports to perpetrate their diabolic political and ethnic agenda. Such was his pursuit of equality and justice in sports that he created his football club called Zeke's Athletic Club. The club was a place where people from all walks of life, religion, and ethnicity could come and freely participate in the beautiful game of football. The club even won the Livas League in 1942. Following those successes, Azikiwe established several other soccer centers across the nation in a bid to promote national unity. Some African historians have stated that Azikiwe's football club laid the foundation of the Nigerian national team, which would later be dubbed the Super Eagles. He was a columnist for a number of famous African-American newspapers, influenced by the famous Ghanaian educator, James Emin.
Azikiwe was serving alongside, at that time, the Nigerian presidency was more ceremonial than, didn't have as much powers really. And he had also the prime minister back then was also a good man. So now on this, it looks like the British people made a double mistake in having Azikiwe as the president. And now his prime minister was even the prime minister's name was Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. So the two of them now, with Azikiwe not having as much power back then, because as I said, it was more of a ceremonial post. It had power, but not as much as it does today. It did not have as much power as Tinubu does, because real political powers were with the prime minister. His prime minister was Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. So during the 1966 coup, they both had to be eliminated, removed from power, I mean. And the prime minister was not as lucky, and he was assassinated in 1966, only having been in power for how many years? A few years. 1963 to 1966. For only 3 years. 3 years were enough to show the British people that we made a mistake in choosing these two people, and we have to get rid of them as soon as possible.
Kwegyir Agray, 1875 to 1927. Nnamdi Azikiwe sailed to the United States to further his education. After a 2-year preparatory course at Storer College in West Virginia, he enrolled at Howard University, Washington, D.C. In 1932, he graduated with a master's degree in religion from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania.
Azikiwe was like many other African leaders, airlifted. You remember me talking about the Kennedy airlift? There was this airlift where they were taking every person that they wanted to install as a leader somewhere. So they would be airlifted, taken to, if it was a Portuguese colony, they would be taken to Lisbon. If it was a British colony, the British colonies would be taken to the US. That is where most of the British colonies were taken. That is how the likes of Tom Mboya were taken there, the likes of Jomo Kenyatta. That is how the likes of even Azikiwe had education. Because at that time, come to think of it, in the 50s and the 40s, I mean, right now, even in 2024, it's hard for an African to fly to the US to get education. Imagine how hard it was in 1940s and 50s, after the many years of Africa being kept in the dark, for just a random Nigerian man to fly to the US and get education there, enroll to all those top colleges. And it was impossible unless somebody was doing that for you. That is after the many years of darkness that Africans had been kept in. So I do not believe that any person who went to these airlifts went there by their own means. Nobody would have even known that there was another country up there. It was not even an exaggeration, but Africa had been kept in darkness for so long that they didn't even have the basic literacy. They couldn't even read and write. They couldn't even read and write back then. Colonialism had kept them in the dark and in ignorance for so long that they couldn't even. So every person who you hear was airlifted, I don't know, in the 40s and the 50s, studied in the US, studied in Lisbon. All those were strategic because it had reached a point where the colonial masters knew that they had to leave and it was getting too hot for them to stay in Africa. And so that is how the likes of Nnamdi Azikiwe was airlifted. Matter of personal choice, came back to Africa, did what he was supposed to do.
Followed this up with another master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1934. He briefly took up a graduate student instructor job at the university before working as a columnist for famous newspapers, such as the Baltimore Afro-American.
And when he came back to Africa, he actually started writing news. He started publishing a newspaper for himself. He was the one who established a newspaper. There was a famous West African newspaper that was doing rounds at that time. At that time there was a network of intellectuals, people from different West African countries had been airlifted, had just come back to Africa. So there was that spread of intellectualism in that part of West Africa. So even publishing newspaper and journals and books, and it was possible for you to pass information through such, because we had people who had gone to school now, people who are now learned. And that was why when Nnamdi Azikiwe came back, he started publishing a newspaper. It was called the West African Pilot, and it was the one that used one of the publications that were responsible for the Nigerian independence, because now it was a platform, it was a way for the intellectuals in Nigeria to communicate, to pass ideas, to rally support. So one of the reasons the independence in Africa was accelerated was that it took two fronts, the intellectual front and the military front. And the intellectual front pushed intellectually, fought for seats in the Ledge Corps, wrote letters, did speeches, published books and newspapers and magazines. They pushed in that direction. Then there was the military front that would push the white man out by force, by shooting them, by burning down their houses. So now, when the war took the two fronts, it was difficult now for them to, because I understand that some people did not even understand what was happening in Africa. Some people in the West did not understand what was happening in Africa. The Berlin Conference had not been made so public. So some people did not even understand. For example, you look at the black community in the US, did not understand at some point. It didn't understand what was happening in Africa and some other. So now with the intellectual front, that the likes of Patrice Lumumba, they would go and do speeches. The likes of Tom Mboya would go and do speeches in the US, in the student communities and in other black communities and in other communities and forums. Now the world was starting to know that there was a place where colonization was still happening and slavery, and people were getting killed and murdered for being black, and the noise became too much. And even now the other blacks had returned from Burma, that is in the Second World War. For example, in Ghana, 66,000 of them, in Kenya in their thousands, in Tanzania in their thousands, and they now knew how to use the guns. So now the white man did not know which front to fight first and which second, because they're getting shot in the forests by the Mau Mau in Kenya, by the Maji rebellion in Tanganyika, now called Tanzania, by the uprisings in the Upper Volta, uprisings in the Gold Coast. and they couldn't hide anymore what was happening, because now the others like Azikiwe were writing publications and sending them to the West. So that is why they were forced now to move out. And they moved out in phases. They started by allowing the blacks to be in the parliaments, back then called the Leg Cause. That is, if it was a British colony, the Legislative Council, they started by allowing them to be in the Legislative Councils. Then they gave them governorship roles, such as Nnamdi Azikiwe was the governor of Lagos for some time, a governor in Nigeria, so the first black governor. So they gave them the governors some few seats. Still, that was not enough. The military wing was still up there uprising, and the people are still. They did the same with Kwame Nkrumah. They gave him they gave him a seat first in the LegCo, in the then as the prime minister, where he made a few changes in the constitution. So, but they realized that that was not enough, and the uprisings were still coming up, and now they had to have a plan B, where we actually have to leave, but why don't we leave someone to run our own affairs? Well, that worked in many African countries. I would say in 60-70% of the countries it did work. The people they left continued running their affairs. An example being Kenya. The one that they left was following the script. So are many other African countries. So they were actually, the plan did work, but not fully, because in some other African countries the people did not follow the script, and they stood with their own, the likes of Patrice Lumumba, the likes of Nnamdi Azikiwe, the likes of Nkrumah, the likes of Sankara, and so many others. So as we come almost to the end, I don't think we're going to finish with the Nnamdi Azikiwe video, but he was a very important figure in the Nigerian. When we talk about the people who built Nigeria, he's a very monumental figure who would have seen Nigeria a better country than it is. Him and his prime minister, that is why they had to be removed 3 years into power. It took 3 years for them to realize we made a mistake. He was not assassinated. Lucky for him, he was able to escape the assassination. He was cooled, but not assassinated. They said his prime minister was not lucky, he was assassinated. But for him, he died many years later from natural causes, I would say, because he died in 1996, still in Nigeria. But he was a good man. You compare him with the other presidents Nigeria has had, looks like Nigeria, it gets worse in Nigeria. Every new president is worse than the last one they had.
Philadelphia Tribune and the Associated Negro Press. His time in the United States also saw him become a disciple of Marcus Garvey's political, social, and economic policies, also known as Garveyism. Founding member of the African Morning Post. Following his return to Nigeria around 1934, he had quite a challenging time finding a job of his liking. After failing to secure a teaching post at King's College in Lagos, he turned his attention to Accra, Ghana. He took up Alfred Okense's offer of senior editor at the African Morning Post in Ghana, formerly Gold Coast. As an editor, his professionalism was top-notch and beyond reproach, earning significant praise from his fellow journalists. He also took under his wings several journalists, inculcating in them a sense of black pride and Pan-Africanist ideologies. He was a vocal supporter of African culture and philosophy. While at the newspaper, he used the nickname Zeke in writing many of the articles in his very famous column, The Inside Stuff by Zeke. Nnamdi Azikiwe blasted Africans and the upper class who were bent on maintaining the colonial mentality. He was quite dismayed at their unwillingness to criticize the manner in which African youth were indoctrinated into thinking Western culture superseded the various cultures in Africa. Those ideas, Zekism, of his would later culminate in his book, titled Renaissance Africa, 1973. He also used the newspaper to caution against petty ethnic and tribal conflicts. In his
So you can clearly see that for some of the things, we may not finish the video because the chat is coming up in a bit, but you can see from just the short clip that we've watched, it was impossible for him to remain in power. I mean, how are you talking about having a unified Nigeria in 1964, telling Nigerians to not be divided along tribal lines in 1964? That is, they want Nigeria divided in tribal lines, so it will be easier to rule of a Nigeria, and you are there telling them, do not be divided by colonial rule. Your culture is superior to the white man's. Writing newspapers that are not only circulating in Nigeria but even in other West African countries, telling them that a unified Africa is what we need. That was his ticket to assassination, to the coup. And he's one of not many people actually celebrate Nnamdi Azikiwe as he should be celebrated. We end up celebrating the likes of Nelson Mandela. We end up celebrating many other Pan-Africans who we've been made to believe are Pan-Africans but are not really Pan-Africans, instead of the real Pan-Africans. Because if you are a Pan-African, you are either cooled or killed. At that period, there was no other route. There might have been a third one that the likes of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere used. That is, you be careful, you sit on the fence. You sit on the fence. Do not be too vocal. It was a cowardice approach, but saw him die at an old age. But when you are Pan-African at that time, it was either assassination or coup. Look at all the names. That is what happened to them. You look at all the names. You look at all the people we've been talking about. They were either coup. The coup one were the lucky ones, because the others were assassinated. At least for those ones who were coup, most of them lived for a few more years, sometimes in detention, sometimes in other countries where they ran to seek refuge. But that was the way forward. You look at Patrice Lumumba, you look at Thomas Sankara, you look at Kwame Nkrumah, you look at Amilcar Cabral, who I wish we had time to look at, because he's also my top 5 in terms of people who really made influence in Africa, the Cape Verdean and Guinean revolutionary leader Amilcar Cabral. But we are going to look at him on another day when we get a chance. For now, I'll have to end the show at there. And make sure you join HR to the messenger. He'll be coming up in a bit. He has an amazing guest today. You can have your dancing shoes ready. So enjoy the rest of your weekend. This has been the Diary of a Young Black King, where we're looking at celebrating Pan-Africanism Part 2, looking at some of the most influential Pan-Africans who transformed Africa, not then, but their ideas live on to date. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. It's always a pleasure. Much love.